Hey everybody, welcome back to the Level Up podcast, where we talk to some of the brightest engineering and DevOps leaders about what it takes to build great products, teams, and companies. I'm your host, Ken Rose, co-founder and CTO at OpsLevel. Today, I'm here with Elliot Graebert, who recently left as VP Eng at Convictional. Before Convictional, Elliot spent 12 years at Palantir, growing from a boots-on-the-ground software engineer to ultimately acting as their head of internal infrastructure. Elliot now acts as an advisor for other startups and also spends a lot of quality time with his family. Elliot, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Yeah, so Elliot, why don't we start? I'd love to hear about this just amazing journey you've had, and tell us about your trajectory at Palantir.
Yeah, I started as an intern at Palantir, as a software engineer for a couple of years, but I'd always kind of had an eye for wanting to get into leadership. I think hopefully everyone can look back at their career and they can think of that one lead that really made a difference for their career. And I had someone who had done that for me, and I wanted to be that person. So I jumped into software engineering leadership. I started building up a team, and then eventually ended up shifting from regular software engineering into more of infrastructure developer experience, then a lot of infrastructure automation. And then right about the time that, this is probably like 7 years ago, when Palantir really started to embrace the cloud as a major platform, I was on the forefront of pushing forward managed services, Terraform, Datadog, and all the other different things that are now pretty hot button staples, but we were grabbing them as pretty early in the cycle.
Kind of when they're coming off the assembly line there.
Yeah, Palantir was the first or second company to ever do Terraform Enterprise. I think we were the first company to do Circle CI Enterprise. We were really jumping in there on the bleeding edge, kind of like holding a knife without a handle, bleeding edge.
Right. Any memorable kind of issues with that when you were kind of like on that bleeding edge as you started to integrate all these, what were at the time new technologies?
Definitely. I remember, I think HashiCorp came over to install Terraform Enterprise for the first time, and they had sent us the instructions in Google Docs, and we viewed the history of the doc, and it was definitely written the night before. But the amazing part about working with both those companies, both Circle CI and HashiCorp, was we were able to talk directly with the engineers. We had people like a lot of very good service. So when we were finding bugs, we were able to talk to the people fixing the bugs. And there's something really special about like reporting a bug to the person who knows how to fix it. And they go, "Oh yeah, I can get that out for you. I'll email you a hot fix."
It definitely breaks down that barrier where it feels less like a vendor and more like you're just part of this extended development team.
Absolutely. And I'm a firm believer in relationships in general being like a really important part of effective work environments. So yeah, when you're treating a vendor like just a transactional experience, I mean, it is how you have to scale at some point. But in the early phases, then getting access to talk to them about your reception to a certain feature or how you felt about the direction of the product and things like that, and having someone on the other side that actually wants to hear it is a really fun place to be. So definitely for anyone that's like sometimes a little gun shy about working with a new vendor, a newer company, it's one of those, this is your chance to actually be a part of the story. And it can be really, our relationship with HashiCorp at Palantir, it's been going like 7 years strong, I think.
Nice. Yeah, I've been able to see this at OpsLevel from both sides, right? We're 4 years old with Series A, but in the early days, like we had that relationship because we didn't have a support team. We had like me and John as the founders, right? And but to that point, we always tried to establish that relationship with our customers that we're kind of like an extension of your engine. We want to help you solve this problem, and like yes, if the bugs, like we'll go fix them and do that. And now that we are kind of a little bit bigger and working with new vendors, to your point, it's like it really is special to see that in other companies. It's like it's such a redeeming feeling. Like there was this bug and it just got fixed, right? And they love it because like their product's getting better. You like it because like the thing you were stuck on just got improved, and it's just a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was wondering if you could talk about, 12 years at Palantir must have been a ton of great lessons. Anything from like maybe starting in the early days, like as a software engineer, that you kind of like had as an important takeaway?
I was a classic college new grad. I worked just nights and weekends. I was always making sure I was there early in the morning. I was there late at night. I was making commits, 2:00 in the morning. And I was working super hard. I was given a problem set, write end-to-end testing. That's your job, like automate end-to-end testing for the QA team. And I was like, I'm going to automate the most that I possibly can. Not gonna lie, we got to about, I think, 3 to 5,000 hours worth of automated E2E testing. We hired a team of like 30 to 40 software engineers. We had thousands of virtual machines going up and going down. I think some of our larger clusters were doing about cycling through like a couple million VMs per year to make all this happen. And it was insane, like how much stuff we did. And then all of a sudden one day, I met with the new director of engineering, who's like, so we're spending 40 software engineers and we're finding how many bugs? No, this is not worth it.
Right.
And they just tanked the team and they deleted all the stuff in about a course of a week. And it was absolutely devastating emotionally at the time to be told, like, the thing that you've been working on for like 3 to 4 years now, ridiculously hard. And I'd been getting great feedback the whole time from my direction of the business, but then there was just the disconnect, and it turns out what I was doing wasn't that valuable, and I was too blind to see it. I went home in tears. Like, I was the most crushed I've ever been to think about all that time I spent, and there was a lot of deep reflection.
And let me ask, like, how did you get over that? Because after 3 to 4 years, kind of the average tenure in a, startup is like kind of 2 to 4 years, right? You were able to overcome it. Like, how are you able to do that?
So I immediately started applying to other companies, immediately.
Oh, okay.
To try to leave. But something that had hit me when I was doing a lot of the infrastructure automation was the value of what AWS could potentially provide. And Palantir at the time wasn't leaning in heavily to using S3 and RDS and SQS and Lambda functions. Obviously that came later, but they weren't really using the first order features. And I was so fascinated by what could be done in the cloud versus what our on-prem data centers looked like that I began spending about an hour or two a night just studying AWS. So during my day job, I was still a software engineering lead. In the evening, an hour or two studying. And I did that for about 6 months. And I was able to pass, I don't know if it's still as difficult, but at the time, the professional certification for solutions architect for AWS was fairly challenging.
It had some rigor to it, yeah.
So it was fun, and it was a path I took to try to learn as much as I could about this new domain. And then, right as I was starting to finalize some interviews going externally, there was an amazing engineering lead. His name's Mark Elliot. He came in and was like, "I want to redo our entire build system chain." And I was like, "Cool, I'll do it only if I can do it on AWS." I didn't tell them I was leaving, but in my mind, I was like, the chance to architect up and actually do like a first order cloud native infrastructure solution, I couldn't have asked for a better opportunity. So I grabbed a team of people. If they ever watched this, they'd be called the Andrews. Ironically, it was 3 different Andrews. We were all in the same office. It was 3 Andrews and me, and we rebuilt Palantir's entire internal build infrastructure, all on AWS, all using modern practices. We introduced the company to Packer, to Terraform, to Docker containers, infrastructure as code concepts in general. We deployed the first schedulers, the first, cloud vulnerability scanners. Like we ended up doing a ton of very forward-facing work, and it was an amazing experience.
That's awesome. So in a weird way, serendipitously, it sounds like Palantir became that new job, right? Or it reinvented itself in terms of this new opportunity of, like, again, building from the cloud up, from the ground up, a cloud native, from the cloud down. I guess clouds are generally in the sky, but from the ground up, this cloud native, kind of build and deploy system.
It was amazing to have so much of a clean slate in which to work in, for sure. I had an amazing set of team members to work with. So yeah, it was like a whole new fresh career. And it came from that studying 2 hours a night, every night for 6 months, and then having like actually a pretty firm foundation on what was possible.
That's awesome. Now, I'd love to talk, I guess, as kind of Palantir's adoption of these technologies grew and the number of teams required to like spin up all these different pieces started to grow. Can you talk to me a little bit about maybe later stage, like how did you start to think about team structure? Or like how did you start to think about aligning teams to achieve specific outcomes?
It was a fairly typical story, right? Where you start with a team of like 4 people, you grow them to be about the size where you start breaking the Bezos's 2 pizza rule, right? And you reach about that size and you start splitting. And then at the same time, the success of the original team started to absorb more teams and responsibilities. So it started from like, let's just worry about developer experience to let's actually solve the company's biggest problem relative to, some security monitoring and some logging things. and then it expanded from there. And as the team grew, we had to figure out subdivisions. The thing that I had learned from my previous time, as I said, my first team where everything got deleted, was really making sure that the number one thing that everyone was aligned to was a business impact. And I got some really good advice from, his name's Khan Tsinga. He's the director at Palantir as well. He gave me some incredible advice, which was to start kind of with the end in mind, almost Seven Habits style. We're starting with what should the ideal team look like? What is the ideal outcome that we should look towards? And then building a team towards that end, as opposed to taking a team you already have and trying to like make it work with who they are.
Yep.
So we started
sort of a top down versus bottoms up approach.
Exactly. So starting with like, hey, what is an area? And so thinking about where could I give someone a vision statement, some direction on like, and some structure around these are the things you're responsible for. Your outcome starts here and ends here in a very clean way. And then thinking how many people does it take to solve that problem? How many people do we actually have available to get it kickstarted? Is it enough that they can actually form a cohesive unit? So about 4 to 5 people. So we thought of a lot of things like, pretty standard split of like a compute and storage team handling the core fundamentals of what does it mean to launch a VM, get it bootstrapped, DNS, monitoring, metrics, all the different like core components, and then dedicated teams towards each outcome, like a collaboration tooling team, a developer experience team, a security tooling team, an authentication team, and each one of those would then rely on the underlying platform team. But each had their own mission statement, their own set of customers. We had like a whole spreadsheet where you could see, who is your target customer and how will you be held accountable to doing a good job.
And how many kind of like as Palantir continued to grow, how did that evolution actually work? How many teams were there sort of like as you were leaving?
Across all of Palantir, there were many teams. For my group, there was 4 to 5 teams, depending on the time. Was about where we were at. But towards the later part of Palantir, well, actually, in general, we were a internal team focusing on internal problems. So, that you end up getting, which I think is a good model for companies to follow. Low headcount but high talent has the best impact. So people that are very good at understanding what they need to deliver to empower everybody else, but also trying to keep those teams resource constrained. Because from my first experience at Palantir, if you're unresource constrained, you will do some things that are a giant waste.
You kind of float to the top of some spreadsheet that an executive's looking at for like, well, where are the areas that we can kind of become more efficient as a business?
So I think slim, high talent teams are absolutely amazing. They're amazing for the individuals. They're very invigorating. They're an exciting place to be on. And I know a lot of the people on my teams at Palantir had tenure of 8 to 10 years reporting to me. So there was a lot of we had a good functioning team. We could accomplish anything we put our minds to. We were good to one another. We had a high trust, low threat environments. So therefore it was a very great place to work.
Awesome. What were some of the ways that you kind of encouraged that? That's phenomenal retention, right? 8, 10 years, 12 years for yourself. Like, what were some of the ways that you kind of foster that high trust and low threat environment?
I think there's a lot of people who say you don't leave a job, you leave a manager. And one of the ways I've seen this happen to high performers is neglect, especially for newer engineering managers, especially people like you're working side by side with the team. You're the one who steps up into this new role. You're like, I'm the one who's going to step up. And it's probably not because you're literally the best coder, but it's probably because you're the one who is the most inspirational, the most, willing to do the job, the most people person. And so you get this immediate fear, at least if you're humble, you get this immediate fear of like, I'm not good enough. What am I possibly going to tell my old peers or the old people at my group, like my best engineer? How am I going to be useful to that person? I should just get out of their way. And, I have this low performer. I'm going to go manage them and try to like solve that problem. And I think it's like a huge miss where engineering managers then are spending their time ignoring their high performers because they're like, I'll just let them do their job. And they focus on their low performers. The low performers at best go from low to slightly higher. Usually 1 out of 10, 1 out of 100 I've seen go from low performers to high performers. And the high performers, meanwhile, are like, there was stuff you could do to help me, but you were never there. And so I've seen that, and it's happened to me in the early part of my career, but then later swapped to saying the most important thing to spend my time on is my high performers. So trying to avoid ever missing a one-on-one with a high performer, always making sure that you're trying to provide them feedback and growth and not getting, I can't think of the word, but intimidated by the incredibly talented people that work for you, and still realizing that even someone very, very talented still has room for growth, and you can still provide feedback to them, even if you can't code better than them.
Yeah, I think there's a very like natural response for humans when they first get into the role of being a manager of like, well, the low performer is a problem, and I'm used to fixing problems, so that's where the fire is. I have to go put that out. But you're absolutely right that from a total return perspective, you're going to get much higher leverage by investing further in your high performer. And just if you have to like sometimes cut and run on the low performer, something I always wonder is like, what's a tripwire that you can get people to kind of hit to know that they have to be doing that before they kind of have to go through the hard pain of like, oh, I did spend too much time with the low performer. Now I have a high performer who's grumpy or maybe thinking about leaving because I didn't put enough time there. Like, is there any sort of a tripwire that you can think of that will let people kind of who haven't had to go through this self-select or recognize like, wait a sec, I'm probably spending too much time here where I shouldn't be, or this is not the most impactful thing I could be doing as a leader?
I don't know of a tripwire to remind you that you're neglecting your high performers, because it's the lack of action, and it's hard to have a tripwire for that. But for low performers, I mean, there's some obvious ones like during the hiring process and during the first 30 to 90 days, they will be acting at their best behavior. If you don't like what you see, cut and run. In the first 30 days, there's no reason to like hold it out, because this is them at their best, not them at their worst. Additionally, I think it's important to give everyone one chance. It's always important to give a low performer a chance, give them a thing. One of the biggest mistakes I think new leads make is not writing down their feedback and expectations. And it's kind of this interesting, like they were working at a high performing level where their lead didn't need to write down tons of things, and they gave them lots of autonomy to go flex their own path. So then they pattern match that down one level to their low perform to all their whole team. And they say, well, they just don't write things down. So the number of times I've worked with a new lead and they have a low performer, and I ask them, great, well, where's the email history in which you've been clearly telling them this is your responsibility, this is your project outcomes you need to meet, these are the timelines, this is what good looks like. And they're like, oh, well, we had a one-on-one about it. It's like, I gotta write that down, man.
Right, right. Yeah, both I guess for the HR side of it, but also so that it's written and that like a report knows what's expected of them and they know when they are or not kind of like meeting the expectation of their manager.
Yeah, and like the HR side, like it's like most things, whether it's compliance, security, HR, there's a lot of things that hit the same vein of the underlying thing they're asking is actually a good thing. And you can interpret it, or you can end up in a position where you're doing something for compliance reasons or for HR reasons. But it's like the fundamental behind writing the feedback down from HR is just the theory that it is really easy to think that the thing that you're saying is being interpreted by the other person the same way because you meant it in a certain way. Writing it down puts it into a medium where it's far less of a debate as to what I said, because it's this email, and
it's unambiguous. Yeah.
And it's less covering it's not as much covering your ass as much as like I have seen situations where the lead thought they were being very clear with what they were expecting, but the individual was like, you never used any of those words. You never made it clear. You never said this was important. I thought it was just a suggestion. And I have seen, again, it's rare, but I have seen low performers make their way to high performers simply by having them say, my exact expectation is this. And that doesn't mean you have to micromanage them, micromanage all their tasks, but it could be as simple as just writing down, I do not expect that I should need to meet with you more than X amount of time, or I expect that you can independently deliver this solution without coming to me. And just writing those words down is what I mean, not going ham and saying I gotta like
to have a track record of every single thing. Yeah. So just making it clear again what the level of expectation is, right? In terms of like, I expect that you can, independently execute on this project without meeting with me, 6 times a week.
Yeah. Not getting into conflicts with your team members or just lots of, but when you give someone a thing to say, this is what it means to do well here, this is what it means to stay employed, do these things, then everything's going to work out. I think that's how you be fair to people in general. And then once you've written it down and you said, this is what it means to stay employed here, do these things, and they still violate those pieces, you have it's a very easy exit conversation. You tell them, I told you couldn't stay here if you failed to execute. You failed to execute on the thing that we agreed to. I don't think this is a good fit. Like,
yeah,
I did my best.
Yep, absolutely. And it's interesting because sometimes people, you mentioned earlier that people don't leave a job, they leave a manager. I think also like sometimes if you have the wrong person for the role, it's not that they're the wrong person, they're just the wrong person for that role. And you can get a better version of themselves in another company or another role on a different team.
Yes.
They're just the role required and the skills they have, there was a mismatch there, right? And it doesn't make them a bad person. It's just how do you get them aligned in a place that they can actually be successful?
I don't remember. It's in a blog post I haven't published yet, but in Radical Candor, I can't remember which chapter, she talks about this particular thing. I don't like the entire book, to be honest. I think there's a little too much fluff in there. However, there is a particular section talking about how to exit people from a good place in your heart. And the things that you're saying ring very true to that, by recognizing that the other person has value and they are a valuable person. They're just not a fit here. And that in another place, in another situation, they're going to excel. And by getting them out of the position that they're not a good fit in, you're actually opening up opportunities for them. And you can say that sarcastically, but if you really believe it in your heart that you're like, I believe this person is a good person, they have value, but it's just not connecting here for some reason. And I'm exiting them out of a good place for everybody.
Yeah. I want to switch gears a bit. Like, I love talking about, managing underperformance. I also want to kind of talk about, again, back to some ideas around team structure. One thing, that strikes me was earlier when you were talking about Palantir being one of the first adopters of Circle CI Enterprise and HashiCorp Enterprise, or pardon me, Terraform Enterprise. It's a lot of enterprise. It sounds like there's a lot of on-prem. And given Palantir's, kind of place in the market, that's not surprising. Can you talk to me a little bit about just how you sort of manage that? Like how many on-prem appliances or on-prem applications were your team working with? And how did you kind of manage that scale? Because I can imagine if it's like kind of just a massive company, if everything has to be brought in-house to be run internally, like I'm anticipating maybe a lot of moving parts there.
That's very true. To answer the question on like how much, like bringing it all in-house and those other pieces, a lot of it, you can have companies that do this from a perspective of, if it's not built here, we don't want it. And then there's a separate perspective of, we don't trust anybody in the universe, it all has to be on us. I think the right way to do that assessment is to look at how much you have to lose versus how much your vendors have to lose based on the data that you're sharing with them. It's one of those like, hey, Amazon's $1 trillion company. If I put my data on there and they completely, screw everything up, I mean, they've got a lot of money to lose. I should be safe. But then you have other cases where you're like, oh man, that startup, if they lost my data, I'm 10 times their size. They don't have the right security team in place. They don't have the right practices and other pieces. So Palantir did a pretty good hybrid of where the risk didn't outweigh the reward. We pulled them internally where it was acceptable to use SaaS. So our team focused really heavily on because we were slim headcount, automate as much as possible, spend a lot of time up front to make the services, ephemeral, fully infrastructure as coded, and make it so that it's as push button as possible to upgrade. So that once you've got that system in a good place, you can move on to the next application. So our team kind of became like a sponge for absorbing responsibilities repeatedly. So I know our developer tools team had, I think 120 applications they ran, where like GitHub was one, Circle was one. So they had a ton of different use cases, and the team was incredible and extremely talented. And they did a really good job automating all those infrastructure to try to make it so that, you're only spending a little bit each month on those services. But keeping track of 120 services, 120 Datadog dashboards with 120, Packer repos with 120 Terraform repos became a lot.
Was there any kind of tooling that you invested in to be able to get just a better comprehensive view of like, here's all the stuff we have and like, here's how it's doing and how it's running?
Well, it's what brought me to talking with you on this podcast about Ops Level in the first place, was that I tried to build Ops Level very poorly, but I tried, man. We assigned 2 software engineers to try to build a generic platform that would be our like dashboard that would have like the names of the services and where to find their ops documentation, where to find their metric dashboards, up and down alarms, like user docs, and like try to create like a standardized system. And I spent like a year on that, and it just was terrible. To be honest, it was too much effort. So we went back to just like uh, wiki pages. We tried a bit to do like maybe if we just use Terraform enough and we just Terraform, and if we could just Terraform more, we'll have all the tags that we need to like auto generate docs, and that didn't work. So we went back to like I'll just make a spreadsheet. I'll just list out the names of the services. There'll be a column for Datadog. There'll be a column for the ops doc, and I always felt really bad that it was something I had tried like 2 to 3 different times over 10 years. And I was never able to get something better than the Google Sheet. And I always wanted a piece of software that did it better.
Yeah. What were some of the actual challenges you faced as you were trying to build your own kind of internal versions of Ops Level?
In order to just the feature creep for, you want to have like a link to documentation. But then, these people want to document as like GitHub READMEs, and these people want to document in the wiki, and these people want to document, in Notion or something. And it's like, oh my God, like I need to integrate with all those different pieces. And so there was this constant like, okay, I got to keep doing more along those lines. Metrics was the same way. The metrics kept changing. And then it was, yeah. And then it was hard to get it sticky enough that people were like, yes, this is definitely worth it. Even though you're spending 2 full-time software engineers building it, this is totally worth it for us. And it was like, it's too expensive. We need something easier.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually that's the origin story of Ops Level. We saw so many companies building this tooling internally, and two, I think it's on the low end. We saw teams of like 5, 6, 7, 8, like kind of fuller size 2 pizza teams, 100% dedicated. And we're like, it just feels like the engineer in me was like, we have to refactor this in the market in a sense. Like, can't one company just build this tool and then bring this to everybody else? And you're right, there is a ton of work just on integrations to be able to support. Oh, you're using Datadog, you're using Grafana, you folks are using Prometheus. Most of the time, sometimes in the same company, it's like you're using all 3 across different company or different services. So yeah, that was our raison d'etre, and we're still at it today, adding capabilities, adding new integrations. The software landscape is kind of never changing. So yeah, it is a business. It is its own product in a sense.
I'd love to touch on that point for companies where the same technology is deployed 3 or 4 times, because it's like an interesting like system where I was thinking about the book Thinking in Systems. I've been reading it lately, so I've been trying to like recognize these patterns lately. And so what's interesting is when you have a company that's very technologically democratic or kind of free market, where I know, and I've worked with a lot of different companies through some of like my advisorships, and there are companies like banks that are like, this is the technology you will use. It must be this technology. And it makes a lot of sense because a bank has a lot to lose that I do not want them to lose. I don't want to lose my money in my bank. I am really grateful that they have very rigid processes, but as a result, they move slow. They're not really invigorating places to work in the grand scheme of things compared to the hot startup. But then the hot startup then is like, hey, we're going to make it possible for you to just pick and choose your own adventure for what technologies and different ideas you have. And, as bigger company gets, you start seeing those things like, well, one team wanted to start using Prometheus for a certain use case. Another team was using Datadog. And it's like, is that a sign of unhealthiness or healthiness? And it's an interesting, like, well, kind of both. It's an indicator that that company has freedom to pick the best technology and allow developers to have that autonomy. But now you have 2 equivalent systems.
I have very strong opinions on this because I can tell you the experience I had. This was at a company I worked at before Startup. The tension is sort of like autonomy versus leverage, right? On the one hand, you want all your teams, DevOps, like you build it, you own it, you do you. Like you want to use Prometheus, go for it. Like Grafana, great. Something that doesn't, Loki or whatever the new hot shit is, absolutely. And that's great autonomy. The challenge is though, it wrecks the ability to reorg. It wrecks the ability to move people around or any kind of fungibility or any kind of real leverage that you get and the experience we had was, we had Kubernetes, this was like 2015. So Kubernetes was becoming the winner, the clear winner. But, HashiCorp had Nomad and, a lot of the other Hashi things are great. So there were a lot of very vocal like Hashi support. We have to use Nomad. Mesos, was kind of still around, right? DCOS hadn't fully pivoted to being a Kubernetes thing. So we actually had all 3 running. Like, I can't tell you how, and this wasn't a large deployment, right? We probably had, I don't know, this was at PagerDuty, like 50 services in production. So to have three different schedulers running in prod was like nuts. It meant there was just a lot more operational thrash. It's like, oh, you have to go like re-roll the pods or redo something here. It's like, oh, I have to now learn yet another system, right? We also had a programming language evolution. Like there was classic story, a monolith written in Rails, and then Scala became on vogue, and then Elixir became on vogue. There's a bunch of Python stuff for machine learning. So again, you had to be an expert in like 4 or 5 different programming languages and frameworks to be able to effectively like do your job or implement a feature that touched a bunch of different services. And yeah, it just killed it. It killed any kind of ability to reorg or actually be effective.
One of the things that my team did that I was pretty proud of, we made it so taking a step back, incentive structures. I think so much of our world is based on incentive structures. And when you look at dysfunctional organizations and you think through how was it possible that we generated 2 different container schedulers? It'd be like, well, I bet you their incentive structure was for each team to be seen either as an idea creator, an inventor, adopting some latest tech, or maybe that tech worked specifically for their use case and they're rewarded based on the success of their use case. And they were not not punished isn't the term, but like de-incentivized based on the breadth of technology. And so as a result, that's what they picked. So when you think of those situations, one of the things we did was I wanted to incentivize getting rid of old things and standardizing. How do you keep, I thought of it like making bread. You do the spread out phase, you grab a bunch of technologies, but you got to crush some things down and like refocus it back up again. So we had like a leaderboard of gravestones that we had built up on a whiteboard. And every time you got to kill a service, we would do it in like a team all hands meeting, the final delete button. We'd all clap and cheer. And it was artificial what I was doing, but I was purposely trying to make it so that you get more aplomb for deprecating a service than creating one. There was a lot of suspicion whenever you'd create a service. I'd always poke really hard on maintenance, on like why it was being created, what its vision was. But when it came to deleting a service, oh man, everyone can like openly cheer. And I'd put that in people's performance reviews. I'd say like, you deprecated this service. That's worth a lot of money to me that you were able to get us off of Atlassian Bamboo as an example, which was a thorn for a long time. And by setting up that incentive structure so that people were rewarded for reducing the technology scope, I think we did a pretty good job of actually trying to make things sustainable in the long term.
That's a really great observation. I love the practice also. 'Cause you're absolutely right. Like humans are motivated by the incentives, or humans in organizations, I think, are motivated by their incentives. And, there's the maxim like deleted code has 0 maintainability costs. And something like deleted services have 0 maintainability costs. They have 0 financial costs. Like it's net good when things go away in product outside of like, data loss and, customer functionality and all that. But like if you can get rid of a moving part in prod, only good things will happen.
During my time at Palantir, I had a team that we went through 3 different leadership structure changes at least, but taking them from 3 different perspectives. We had a software engineering director manager person. We had a pretty classic CIO, and we had a CISO. And at one point in time, we all reported into those chunks. And what was fascinating was, as you might expect, when we reported to the software engineer, the creation of new software was rewarded. You created new software, you built a new application, and the new application is awesome, and you built it. So that got the greatest aplomb. So during that phase of my career at Palantir, creating things was the most important. The next job was then under the CIO, and then it was much more about maintainability, sustainability. How do you do more with less? Because now all of a sudden we were under headcount constraints. So it all became, how are you able to expand your scope into more impact without us having to hire a single more person? So automation, infrastructure as code became the thing. Then when we reported to the CISO, it was security. If you could suggest a project that improved the security of the business. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I think this is a great thing. I think it tells you that your ability to affect your organization can be manipulated by thinking about the incentive structure. So if you need a more secure business, put a security person in charge of your infrastructure team, and your infrastructure was going to get more secure.
That's really, again, I love the throwback to, again, incentives. It's like, what are we optimizing for as a business? And then that's the direction the team's actually going to go in.
Yeah.
There's one other topic I kind of wanted to pull on here with you, Elliot, which is you talked a little bit in some of your blog posts around this idea of facets, like the different kind of requirements that services should have. And some of them are non-functional requirements, some are functional requirements. Can you talk maybe a little bit about some of what those facets are, but also ways that teams can take, here's this list of things that should be important, like what OS version are we on, and how scalable is something, but actually turn that into practice and process.
Yeah. I kind of want to take one step to kind of explain the origin of that post. So the post you're referring to is the many facets of infrastructure, and it includes that Google spreadsheet, right, of 60 facets. It came from a very interesting question, which was tying back to our previous conversation. There were three separate architectures at Palantir all at the same time, run by three separate teams. And we all had used in various ways different technologies. Like some people were using Ansible, some people were using Puppet, some people were using EC2 instances, some people were using Docker containers, and we had the Nomad versus Kubernetes problem. And so we had this, and I wanted to, for a roadmap, come up with a quantitative way of comparing two architectures. And so I started listing out every single technical decision that had to be made for infrastructure. So DNS, how do you SSH into it? How do you do two-factor auth? How do you, what library do you use to automate the installation of software onto an AMI? What software do you use to orchestrate the baking of that? What's the software that you use to CI that? What's the, dot, 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 dot. And it came up with these 60 facets that honestly, when I looked at any individual service, no matter where I looked, I was like, yes, all 60 of these apply to every service you might host internally. So I'd started from that as a way of like comparing architectures. It was really interesting to think, I measuring the percentage of similarity across two different pieces. And then taking that, I began saying like, okay, where are there natural foundational layers? So I started from like, what does it mean to get the AWS infrastructure up in the first place? What does it mean to get an image to have libraries on it? And as I started going through that, I started trying to bucket that into things that would be owned by specific teams.
It really was kind of going through the different layers to understand like what are the concerns that are important, and then also assigning ownership to those concerns so that you had specific teams that were again incented to care about those concerns and like ensure that like there was some minimum bar that was being passed.
And kind of the one of the techniques that we used to try to do this, we did a process that we called system health. I've seen different versions of this, but essentially we came up with a system health approach of saying every quarter we are going to analyze the system health of each one of our services. We're going to define a set of facets. How do we feel about them relative to security? How do we feel about them relative to monitoring and data and those other pieces? And then we'll use that as a way of saying, hey, for any service that we have that's a high priority service that's in a low rating, and we did like a 1 through 5 rating, we would then say, okay, we're going to prioritize 10% of our team this next cycle to improve that area. As the teams were broken up, a lot of their mandate was stuff like the core central team, which owned most of these facets. The core central team were told basically, the other teams have the choice to use you. You are the best choice for now. So what are you doing to make certain that you are always the best choice for that team? Because I will judge your team based on the feedback of the other team's ease of use of using your services. So if the CI engine we were using for Terraform wasn't very good, it's like, cool, well, that's on the central platform team who needs to decide what is a better solution for those teams. And it was an interesting mix of like, especially in DevOps, where sometimes you run the service for people and you're like, I will run Terraform Enterprise for your team. And in other cases, it was all about the modules where you would say, I will create a module and I will hand you the code and you can run it yourself. Because that's actually the best way to do it. I can make sure that the code will work for you, but I kind of need you to own the actual like running of it.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. In terms of going through that, it sounded like it was a quarterly exercise of going through the facets and evaluating the services. How did you folks actually go about doing that? Was it like whip out the big old spreadsheet again and kind of go through the facets and okay?
Yep, we had just a spreadsheet and color coded it. It's a great engineer and a friend of mine named Usher Amir who came up with this idea. Specifically at Palantir, and it got adopted pretty wide. And it was a really cool idea having these system health assessments and this process for constantly reanalyzing what does it mean to improve the security of our processes, or what does it mean to improve the availability? How does our disaster recovery feel? So yeah, and every quarter whip out the spreadsheet, run through all the numbers again, and it was a little bit qualitative and quantitative. Because it was like, rating it 1 through 5. We had some heuristics to it, but they weren't as specific. When I checked out, Ops Level has a feature that does this natively, and the part that I found amazing about it, that really interesting, was the way you could be very specific. Like the next level of maturity means that you have blank logs in like the sim or something, and that was something that we always had to do with like just checklists and not any type of live system or live check or other pieces. And but the idea was still the same. It was just kind of, our version was a very rudimentary, like, it worked for us.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's also it's a very natural starting point. I think spreadsheets are the starting point for like every business problem that exists. It's like, okay, let's put data in a table, and then we can have a meeting about it, and then you start to realize like, oh, maybe we could have software that helps automate a lot of this, right? And we've done a lot of work on maturity, and we did our own evolution. We started with checklists internally, like in ops level, and the challenge was we realized it didn't really help align a certain outcome. Like, what does it mean I'm passing 6 of 9 checks, right? That's why we kind of implemented maturity, because we found it was just a better mechanism for organizations to get an across the board visibility. I'm like, okay, where do we need to invest, right? And it's hard to be able to reconcile that when, like, here's a service that's passing 7 of 9, here's another service that's passing 7 of 9, but the two that are failing are different. Like, they have different levels of priority in terms of what's important for us this quarter.
There's a lot of value in that. I'm a big believer in quarterly planning. At least I like to run projects usually in a like week by week basis. I don't really like going as far as Scrum's model. I think it's too much. I like the week by week. Every Monday, let's reset. Let's figure out what this week should look like, and then figuring out either a quarterly or on a trimester system or something where you get back together and say, let's reset and really think about how to do the longer term planning. Something that's really valuable about having the transparency of a standardized process, like everyone must do a system health assessment, whether it's through ops level or a spreadsheet, doesn't matter. Like, as long as you're doing it and you can present that information up, as you said, in a nice way, that's how you start to get decisions. Like during a quarterly plan, a senior leader can go, well, your system health is actually pretty low. What are you doing this quarter to prioritize that? And if you don't have that data, I have often ended up in those quarterly plans where everyone just wants the new feature and no one is sitting there arguing, well, what are you doing about technical debt? And it can be really hard to argue that thing. So by having a mechanism that tries to put a number or a rating or something on your own work makes it so much easier to prioritize. So for anyone listening who's in a place where they don't have a process for analyzing and grading their own work, it has a lot of compounding value, not just internal to your team, but the external visibility.
For sure, yeah. Numbers are sort of emotionless. Like, there's no ambiguity about like a quantitative measure of where something's at and whether or not we need to invest there.
100%. And it is so hard as an infrastructure team, especially internal infrastructure teams, but in general, to prioritize the technical debt that doesn't look like it has an impact on the business. One of my favorite metaphors is the crystal ball metaphor, where theoretically every action you do, if you had perfect insight to every possible outcome, you could predict how much revenue that decision generates or doesn't generate. You know what I mean? So it's theoretically possible to say the work that I spent working on improving my backups 4 years from now pays off due to a massive outage that we have. Like, if you had perfect knowledge, and while we don't have a crystal ball, we're far better than nothing. We don't have nothing when we think about these pieces. And but it is really hard for like investing in backups or investing in security to come up with the number for how much revenue does my increased security give us.
Yeah, a mental model I've had is that I think of this like I bucket companies as either companies that help you make money, save money, or reduce risk. And the making money or saving money are easy, but the reducing risk is the squishy, nebulous, insurance-y part, where it's like, to your point about backups, it's like, yeah, if we don't do this and we have a bad day 4 years from now, like, it's gonna be a really bad day. How much is that worth investing now to avoid that?
I have a tagline on a post I have ready to get published on, which was cost minimization, revenue maximization, or risk reduction in service of free cash flow. And, I think I had one other word in there, but I lost it. But yeah, risk reduction. So yeah, no, it's that trifecta of pieces that is, risk reduction though is still really hard for me. Like, you talk to the security person, and almost every security person I ever met tells you how everything is a dumpster fire and everything could be made so much better, right?
But it's also there's gradients on that risk, and then what are the mitigations you can put in place, and yeah, there's always ways to improve though.
Yeah, this is true.
Listen, Elliot, before we wrap up, I always love to ask my guests just what's your favorite music to actually work to, or when you want to focus time.
Chromeo.
Chromio? Nice.
Yep, Chromeo's
Um,
their music is so happy and upbeat, and I don't know, it's
yeah.
like they've got some great stuff. They did some great stuff during the quarantine that is just absolutely hysterical, but pretty fun.
All right. I think I'm trying to remember. I think I saw Chromio at a concert once. It was this was when I was at Shopify, but it was Shopify. They brought like amazing, DJs and music people for like different events, and so I'm pretty sure like Chromio was one of them. So I'm gonna have to. I haven't heard their music in a few years, but I think I'm gonna queue them up on my playlist again.
Nice.
And also, what's the best way for people to follow your work on social media?
Right now, I just post on Medium a lot is the place where I go. So I post everything to LinkedIn, but I link it all back to Medium. So if you're interested in any of the things that I have written about, come check me out there.
Awesome. Well, so for all of our listeners, we're going to be posting links to Elliot's Medium, blogs and writings, as well as LinkedIn in the show description below. And kind of summarizing our conversation, we learned just a ton about how to structure DevOps teams, how to incent those teams to really become high performing. So, Elliot, it has been absolutely great having you on, and I really appreciate your time today.
It's been great. It's been great being on. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. Yeah. To all of our listeners as well, thank you again for making it to the end of another episode. If you have any topics or guests you'd like to see on the show, please send us an email at levelup@opslevel.com, and we'll see everybody next time. Happy building.